The NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. 21 plus and present in select states. First online real money wager only. $5 first deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets which expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Rated RP to M. You're listening to an ad for PC Game Pass. Want new games on day one like Avowed or Football Manager 25? Say nothing if you're getting excited. Thought so. Did I mention legendary franchises like Diablo? And all for one low monthly price? 3 words. We got you. Learn more at xbox.com/PC Game Pass. Some games reference coming soon. Game catalog varies by region and over time. Any questions? I'm just kidding. I can't hear you.
Hello and welcome to the Oregonian Sports Podcast, first episode of 2025. I am Bill Oram, sports columnist at the Oregonian, joined as always by Brenna Greene from KOIN 6. Brenna, Happy New Year.
Now, Happy New Year to you too. You know, we got to say that. I don't actually think we said that to each other in person because we were more enamored with each other's matching taupe fits. But, you know, Happy New Year. There you go.
Well, it is fitting that we both wore matching earth tones at the Rose Bowl because we then watched the Ducks get pounded into the dirt by Ohio State. A absolute rear end kicking. What was that?
I said molly-whopping.
Exactly. Or as my colleague Nick Daschel, the last living person who remembers the Buchanan administration calls it a country rump roasting. That's a term that I have withheld putting into print, but is a great Daschel term that I think of often during blowouts now. Brenna, there's a lot to unpack from the Rose Bowl, and I know we're about a week out now, but you know, we spent so much time looking forward to that matchup with Ohio State, the rematch, the college football playoff, the 12-team playoff. From the game itself, I'm happy to yield the floor. I don't know what there is to say other than, wow, Ohio State's really, really, really good.
Yep. Exposed
Oregon's deficiencies, particularly on defense. I thought Chip Kelly called a perfect game. Outcoached Tosh Lupoy for sure. Ohio State outcoached Oregon across the board. You know, Dan Lanning said as much. I mean, coaches obviously take accountability after losses like that, but I thought it was true. Oregon's players made mistakes, and it was over before Oregon even had a chance to pick itself up off the mat. When you saw Ohio State, jump out to a 34-0 lead before halftime, there's no coming back from that. They scored on the third play of the game. I mean, we can go down the list, but Oregon has not been so soundly defeated in a game since Dan Lanning's first game.
Yeah, the Georgia game.
2022 in Atlanta. And I think that there's all sorts of themes, but I want to know kind of what your big takeaway from that game as you got on the plane the next day back to Portland. What were you thinking about that Rose Bowl?
I mean, I think for me, it wasn't quite a similar feeling, but I have unfortunately, been here before in my career. It felt a little similar to the Gonzaga-Baylor National Championship game of 2021, where you go in and you expect this to be this insanely, yes, thank you. Thank you so much. If you're listening, Bill just did the drink motion. Because I said my alma mater's name. It was one of those games though that everybody went in and thought it was going to be this great all-time game. These two teams that were obviously better than everybody else all season long, and then you get that, and you just don't even know how to process it because you're like, I was not. I don't know. Well, I do know what I was expecting, and it was not this, So just a very weird thing, and I couldn't help but find myself thinking yesterday, I would have been on a plane right now to Dallas. Like, what? You're trying to tell me I would have been going to Dallas? And you and I, if we were, still like, if we were still covering the Ducks, would have been through media day by now as we're recording this, which is just crazy. So, it feels kind of like these two like parallel universes that are somehow operating in the same place. But, yeah, I think it's one of those things that, it's one of those games, especially when like you're, just from our perspective, like mentally preparing yourself for what could be a really long 3 weeks. And then just like the way that it was gone so quickly is bizarre. And that's just what sticks with me personally, because that's my personal experience. It's not going to be a fan's experience, but, just having this like, okay, we're probably going to be on the road for the long haul, like blah, 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 blah. And then just having it like snatched out like that, especially as quickly as it was, is just a bizarre feeling I don't think anybody was expecting. And so, still kind of like mulling my way through that, I guess, and is what it is. And, well, we're used to this as sports reporters. We're used to, having things like this happen. So we'll get over it. But it's still something that's sitting with me however many days later. It also feels like the Rose Bowl was about 20 years ago now. So
Ohio State had 5 touchdown drives in the first half. They were, how many plays they were? 3 plays, 2 plays, 1 play. They had, what did I say? How many touchdown drives in the first half? 4?
I thought you said
4.
5.
4 in the first half, and then they had 2 field goals. They had 4 touchdown drives in the first half that totaled 9 plays. Like, it was an absolute like undressing of the Ducks defense.
Yep.
And I don't think any of us were prepared for that, because Oregon's defense has been pretty good all year.
Yes.
Now, there were signs of weaknesses. The secondary's been a little bit suspect all year. Ohio State's receiving core is unbelievable. Obviously, Jeremiah Smith, people like to say he'd be the number 1 pick in the draft if he could come out after a freshman, and that's probably true. So, you are up against a, Randy Moss level receiver in that game with 5'10" cornerbacks. So, legitimately a matchup nightmare for the Ducks, the way this roster is built. But also, like, you can't tell me that, like, scheme doesn't matter there. And, now granted, the Ducks contained Jeremiah Smith, sort of. I think he had 9 catches for 100 yards in the game at Oregon earlier this year.
Yeah.
But, and so to my point about there being signs of things coming, they gave up 500 and some odd yards to Penn State, 270 on the ground in the Big Ten championship game. The defense wasn't lights out. Ohio State has the number 1 defense in the country. Oregon had like the number 13 defense in the country. So good, but not great. Not like national championship level great defense. As good as that as that defensive front is, as much as we all love those linebackers, it wasn't a defense that was on that level. I wrote in the Oregonian that Dan Lanning needs to take a hard look at Tosh Lupoi as defensive coordinator. Gotten some pushback on that, and I certainly agree that Tosh's defenses have gotten better each of the last 3 years. But I think the bottom line is you need coaches who can coach as well as they can recruit. And Tosh has gotten better, but his signature has never been calling a game. And I think that when you look at a team that has a head coach who was the defensive coordinator for a national championship defense, you just cannot lose a game by being exposed that badly on defense. I don't know if that leads to Tosh getting fired. All indications are that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And, that's fine. But that was the kind of game that gets people fired. Like, games can be bad enough and lopsided enough that it is the end. And that to me felt like the end. Dan's probably going to give Tosh another chance, but like if the Ducks have, defensive issues next year, or if a season ends with another undressing like that, I'm going to be pointing to the Rose Bowl the same way I was pointing to the Washington games last year, the Oregon State game 2 years ago, and the Washington game 2 years ago.
Another thing that really struck me as I was leaving that game was, Oregon has kind of systematically leveled up each year under Lanning. Lanning has never taken this team to a playoff situation before. Why did we think that somehow that trend was going to be bucked and be different in terms of like every year Lanning has kind of gotten one step closer?
So this is the year they make the playoff. Next year would be the year in that pattern that they win a game. Yeah. Yes,
exactly. And I was like, I don't know why I didn't think about that. And something that also struck me that I've been thinking about a lot that is very interesting and just a little, this is one of those things that you only know if you were at the Rose Bowl sort of thing. Oregon did that team photo outside of the Rose Bowl and Ohio State did not. And I look back on that and nobody really knew why Ohio State elected not to do it. But the theory was that they'd been there a few years before and Ryan Day just decided, I've been there, done that. We don't need to do this. But I do find it interesting from a psychological perspective of like Oregon did this. And, I said in my piece that day, it could be the first of many team photos or it could be the last one ever. Obviously, it ended up being the last one ever. But it's just an interesting psychological, introspection sort of thing where Oregon is taking this team photo and Ohio State is saying, nah, we ain't doing that because we got more opportunities down the road. And I don't know. I just found that to be kind of an interesting decision by Ohio State, and it kind of signaled something to me now looking back at it.
It was an interesting time. The last month plus was an interesting time for Oregon to start savoring the moment.
Yeah.
The entire regular season, really cool stuff would happen. There would be big wins, and Dan Lanning would be completely detached from the excitement that I think fans were feeling. And when they were ranked number 1 in the country, and I got after him about this, but they're ranked number 1 in the country and he gets asked about it and he says, who cares? Who cares that we're number 1? They beat Illinois, a ranked team at home. And, he doesn't, he doesn't he doesn't ever say the I'm really proud of this team, or maybe he says that, but it's like, he never and so I remember asking him why he does not just for lack of a better term, stop and smell the roses, or why he doesn't, celebrate those moments. Because, people say, it's not the destination, it's the journey. This team felt very focused on the destination all year long, and really just kind of as a trademark of Dan Lanning's program. And Dan had so many quotes along the way in the season. You don't stop eating when there's still plate on your food, I think was one of them. And there's time for celebrating. Plate, yes. And did I say plate on your food?
Yes.
I don't know how you eat at your house, but in my house, the plate goes on top of the food. And that you can celebrate at the end of the season. And I felt like that's very different from how I think sports should work. Not saying that you should think that you've crossed the finish line partway through, but you do have to appreciate the moments because wins are hard. Winning is hard. You don't know when something is going to happen that derails your season. So I think appreciating the moment is really important. And so then you see them at the Rose Bowl, or excuse me, the Big Ten championship game, smoking cigars. A Big Ten championship is meaningful, particularly in the first year. I had no problem with the celebration, but it was interesting to see Dan actually seem to be, Dan was crying on the field after the Big Ten championship game. I did not expect that. That's how powerful that moment was. And then, the Rose Bowl, it did seem like there was a bit of sort of acknowledgement of it being here as an accomplishment. And I don't think that Ohio State felt like being there was an accomplishment, to your point. And it's a really good observation, a really keen observation about the team photo, one I hadn't even made. And it does make me wonder if psychologically, to your point, there was a bit of, hey, isn't it cool we're here? Like, we've arrived because we're here. And Ohio State just didn't have that perspective.
And, it could have just been as simple as Ryan Day remembered taking that team photo and having to stare into the sun for it, and how annoying it was. If anybody saw those videos, it was hilarious. Like, Oregon, like, everyone was dying on that team taking that picture, like, literally crying, because it was so, like, the sun was right in their face and they were trying to keep their eyes open for this picture. And maybe Ryan Day was just like, I don't feel like going through that again. It could have been something as simple as that, but something tells me it wasn't as simple as that. And it just
love that. Love the psychoanalyzing of it.
Yeah.
So one thing we have to, so I think you and I are on the same page. Oregon lost that game, and Oregon is out because they are not as good as Ohio State. They got pounded.
Yep.
And, we can certainly have a conversation over whether, that was just a terrible day for them, or if that was an inevitable outcome in any round of the playoff. But the structure of the playoff has deservingly been a subject of scrutiny.
Yeah.
And we can agree also that in any other format that's ever existed, Ohio State's season would have been over. They wouldn't have even been in a position to play for the championship. And so because the format has changed, it seems to me that other things need to change around it, or should change around it. Now, I don't know what changes the CFP committee is, or whoever. I don't think the committee determines the format, but whoever decides the format will land on, and what tweaks will be made, whether, the buys will not go to conference champions, or whatever adjustments might be made in the next year. But the thing that has struck me, and this is not to say Oregon should have done anything differently. I don't think Oregon did anything wrong from a team standpoint, but the fact that they would have been in such better position had they lost the Big Ten championship game. The fact that they would be playing Notre Dame in the Orange Bowl this weekend, I think, if they had lost the championship game to Penn State, because I got to think they're beating SMU at home, and I really got to think that they're beating Boise State, with on a second look.
Yeah.
So that is obviously a preferable path. Now, you don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but when you look at other sports, and it's like, okay, Kansas City this weekend is a great example. The Chiefs did not play all of their players against the Broncos. That's how the Broncos smoked the Chiefs in the finale, and Bo Nix got to the playoffs. You see this in the NBA. Having now seen a year of evidence that the bye is not the boon that it should be. I mean, all four teams that had the bye lost. Do you think that we could see a situation where teams might treat that play-in game, or excuse me, not the play-in game, the conference championship game as a situation where they're going to rest players, they're going to develop players, they're going to say, hey, we have locked up a spot in the playoff. If a team is 13-0, or 12-0, like Oregon was, teams that are on the fringes can't afford to do this. But if you have a team that's in the same position as Oregon is, could you see them saying, hey, we're not going to play our starting quarterback, we're not going to play our top receivers, we're not going to put them at risk of injury, we're going to develop some other players. Winning this game is not important to us. We've achieved our goal of locking up a spot in the playoff. That's what matters to us. And go from there. Because I feel like that is treating the sport and the games and that is sort of a natural counter reaction to the format of the sport. And you see it in other sports. I recognize that it's not really respecting the integrity of the game, so to speak, but other sports have evolved where that's become the norm. Could college football evolve to where that becomes the norm?
I guess I just see things changing before that would become a norm. I do not think that college football wants to get to a point where, they're fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever you want to call it, in top five most important weekends of the year becomes a joke. And
I mean, the entire bowl season has. I don't care how many people watched it. I mean, you've got an edible mascot Pop-Tart. Like, I mean, you've had to make it a gimmick to make it compelling. Already.
I agree with you 100%. There's just a difference between those bowl games and conference champion. Like, bowl games don't have anything on the line unless you're in a CFP format. Nobody's like, oh, you lost the Pop-Tarts Bowl last year. That's a huge, mark on your resume, whereas, you lose a conference championship game, there's a little bit more gravitas in that, I guess you could say. And it's a weekend that a lot of people are tuning in and watching. So you don't want to bastardize that weekend. You don't want to make it like a weekend where it becomes a dummy weekend. So I feel like things are going to change in how the CFP format is before we get to that point, because that would be a disastrous situation for college football if that were the case. Hey, our playoffs, the system for our playoffs is so messed up that now one of our most important weekends of the year is just completely obliterated. That, and the weekend that kind of builds the hype for what the CFP could be. I just do not think that they would let it get to that point. I mean, I would imagine there are going to be changes. I would be stunned if there aren't changes next year. I wonder, first of all, my thought this whole time was, why aren't we just doing 8? But I know why we aren't doing 8. Let's be real. Because we like money. So we're going to do 12. So if you really like money, why don't you just do 16?
If you really like money, why not do 24?
I know, right? I know. So, I think that we're on the fast track to the CFP getting expanded once again. That's what I personally think is going to come out of this, because of the fact that, it's very obvious that the format this year didn't work.
So I agree the format did not work. I also think that this year presented some really interesting scenarios that I don't think you could have predicted.
Yeah.
Or are necessarily going to repeat themselves. And so, like, if I am the CFP, I do wonder, as an observer, I wonder if the CFP will say, we need more data, we need more years to see if this is going to continue to be a problem. The counterpoint is you just don't have time to wait.
No,
but when
you don't.
you look at the seeding this year, of the top 4, 2 of the teams that were inarguably overseeded, Boise State and Arizona State, go into their quarterfinal matchups as prohibitive underdogs, and then they lose.
Yep.
Georgia goes in as the number 2 team, completely reasonable, loses its starting quarterback in the conference championship game. So now the number 2 team doesn't have the most important player on the field in a game that might be a toss-up anyway. And then, so Oregon's the outlier here, where Oregon is the team that was at full strength, properly seeded, got the so-called advantage of the bye, and then goes in and gets its ass kicked. So I don't know if you can necessarily say that the cause of the effect is that the bye and the time off was the disadvantage, because that really only is true, or is only really suggested to be true, by one team, which is Oregon. So, there is a case to be made that you need to see what this looks like next year, when presumably the Big 12 would produce a more worthy champion, and that the ACC would produce a more worthy champion. But again, the other thing that has to be acknowledged is this system was designed for a world with 5 power conferences.
Yep.
So that you were going to have 4 teams with byes out of 5 power conferences. And so if the Pac-12 still existed, it's easy enough to imagine that the Pac-12 champion would be Oregon, the Big Ten champion would be Ohio State or Penn State. You'd have the SEC champion, and then you'd have one team that maybe kind of stunk. Being relative, Boise State and Arizona State didn't stink, but one team that was maybe not quite worthy, and then that sort of just becomes a wild card in the system. So to me, that has to be considered when you talk about what didn't work. The system wasn't designed for a college football landscape that looked like this. Like all of your good teams, or the vast majority of your good teams, or a disproportionate amount of your best teams, are in 2 conferences. And that's something that happened with the homogenization of the sport in the Pac-12, the death of the Pac-12.
Are you in favor of just taking 1 through 4 and not doing conference champions as the top 4 seeds?
I am, but that's because of how it worked out this year.
Yeah.
I think it's cool that Boise State got to be the 3 seed because of the system. And, but like, I think it would have been cooler if Boise State had gotten to host a home game and hosted Clemson or Notre Dame. And that team had to go to Boise, a place they would never schedule to go in the regular season. And so I go back to, I think the biggest advantage that this system provided was a home field advantage in the first round. And I think also that somehow should trickle down to the best teams in the sport. Like Oregon, if you're the number 1 team in the country, you should get a home game in the playoff. Yeah. If you're the number 3 team, you should get a home game in the playoff. Like, so I don't know if that means you go to 16 and you just do away with buys entirely.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you're saying.
Or you just extend home games through at least the quarterfinal, but then you've got a lot of upset bowl games.
Godspeed.
But I mean, again, you are trying to make a square peg fit in a round hole because you're trying to accommodate all these things that don't fit the system you've created.
No,
bowls do not fit the system that is created.
No,
these New Year's Day bowls do not fit a quarterfinal, semifinal championship system. The playoff structure does not fit a 4 power conference system. Like, so everything was designed in one world and then another world presented itself. And you're going to constantly be chasing your tail if you're college football because things are changing faster than you can adjust.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have one world that was designed in the early 1900s, and then you have another world that was designed in 2000. Like
back when the founding fathers thought of the Cheez-Its Bowl.
So, that is a greater discussion that there is an agreement between the CFP and the New Year's Six, and I do not remember how long that goes. But until that runs out, that ain't gonna change.
Yeah.
So therefore, the format has to change. And yeah, I mean, I definitely, I know that I said a few weeks ago that I liked that the conference championships had something on the line, but obviously I also am someone who can see that. Yeah, I can also admit when I'm wrong, and I think that I was wrong there now that I look back on it it's not just me saying that because of Oregon. It's all of the evidence. And by the way, who knows if we're going to get a team from the ACC or the Big 12 that can rival Big 10 or an SEC team in the near future. Like, those 2 conferences are just they're just so beyond the other 2 at this point. So it is what it is. And I know that that's not what anybody wants to hear from those 2 other conferences, but it is the fact of life. And so, that's just something to take into consideration. I've heard the people saying that we should reseed after the quarterfinals. I don't like that one.
Why?
I mean, first of all, how many sports reseed after a round?
Okay.
Does the NFL reseed? Does the NCAA tournament reseed? Like, I understand injuries happen and they're just different in football than maybe any other sport, but I think that just gets it's just almost getting too much in the weeds. It's just it becomes a whole weird political thing, and I'm just, at some point you got to just let the system be the system and not meddle too much, and it just feels like too much meddling to me, and too much and politics and all that other stuff. At some point, you just got to win. You can't.
Well, that's the bottom line for Oregon. It's like, the Ducks had no control over the system, and they controlled their own fate, obviously, as all teams in this system do. Win and you're the champion. They didn't win, and there was not any question in this game. There was nothing left on the field that made you say, if the Ducks could have done X, Y, or Z better, they would have had to do the whole alphabet better in like 72 languages to win the game. Like, it was as thorough of a win. And the score doesn't do it justice, by the way. 41-21 almost sounds like palatable.
A little respectable.
No, I mean, it was. So there is no argument here that Oregon is out or didn't win a national championship because of the system.
Yeah.
Now, but the system did them no favors, and I do not think they were rewarded enough for having the best regular season, which does, I think, dilute the value of the regular season going forward and brings in the question of, is going undefeated something to strive for, or is it better to pace yourself through the regular season, so to speak, if opportunities present themselves? I mean, do you find a game to load manage your quarterback at the end of the season? We see that in the NFL, or obviously in the NFL, the NBA, it's potentially a 17 or 18 game season. Mm-hmm. So it just seems obvious that you, potentially a 17 game season, but it seems obvious that you would, start to think about it a little bit differently based on what we've seen in this system. Shifting gears, Brenna, Greene.
Yes, Bill.
We are a month away from the NBA trade deadline, or as I like to call it, NBA Christmas. I did not feel that way when I was a beat writer covering the NBA, because it was one of the most miserable days of the year, because I would wake up at 6 a.m. I would start texting my sources who did not text back hardly ever, and then watch Twitter for 6 hours waiting to see whether the team I covered made any moves. And very rarely did they make any moves. There was the day that the Lakers traded Ivica Zubac for Mike Muscala.
Oh, wow.
That was interesting. And I believe that Rob Pelinka, the GM of the Lakers, made some sort of metaphor about, like, two lovers on a streetcar in San Francisco being separated by the crowd, but then finding each other in the crowd. And that was supposed to be the Lakers and Mike Muscala, if I'm remembering correctly. So that was a memorable day.
Yeah.
But, trade deadlines tend to be a little bit of a letdown. Generally, if you're looking for your team to make a big splash to go make a run. The Blazers are in a unique situation. They are not very good. They are not trying to be very good. And they have a lot of players. All things being equal, they should be trading. We're here a month and 2 days away, or a month minus 2 days away. Trade deadlines on February 6th. Blazers have not made any moves yet, but we expect that to change. What are you? Well, that's a fair question. What are you expecting between now and February 6th, Brenna?
The bar is low. Man, it could be a real quiet trade deadline. And that's not even of the Blazers doing, that's of the CBA's doing. If this were the year of our Lord 2024, we might be having a different conversation right now. But it is not. It is 2025, which is the first time I've said that. Wow, it's 2025. Yeah, I don't have high hopes, let's put it that way, that anything is going to be happening come February 6th that has any sort of meaningful impact on the Blazers. I think that unfortunately we're going to have to wait longer for, which is the story of the Blazers and trading people over the however many last few years. It, to some extent, even with Damian Lillard, because I think we all thought that was going to happen very quickly, and then it went on and on and on. Also, it's just very funny watching what's going on in Miami right now. But anyways, just throwing that out there. It's all right. Miami people love me. I went through like a whole day of Miami hate.
Which is an anagram of heat.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have high hopes right now. I don't know if we're going to see anything that is meaningful or impactful. But,
go ahead.
I mean, I was just going to say we shall see, I guess. But I would love to be wrong. I would love to be wrong. But
so you hit on the most important thing, which is the financial aspect of this.
Mm-hmm.
And something that's beyond the Blazers' control. And the new CBA has made teams extremely reluctant to take on big long-term money. It is not financially prudent. It sends you into an extremely punitive apron of the luxury tax. There are very few teams that could say, "Oh, hey, we need Jeremy Grant with his 3 years and $100 million remaining." And because the teams that could really benefit from Jeremy Grant are the teams that are probably already pretty good and are looking for a final piece. Well, teams that are pretty good are already pretty expensive. Yes. So that's why, Jeremy Grant, I don't know that the Blazers can trade him, even though they would like to. They would like to be able to trade him and get some assets back and start putting everything, around the young front court of the future. Same with DeAndre Ayton, but at $38 million a year, he's really, really hard to move. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to find a scenario in your mind where DeAndre Ayton makes sense anywhere else, especially with that money. Yep. Same with Anthony Simons, whose contract is more palatable, but is still $25 million a year. And he has not been great this year. He's been better the last couple of weeks, but hasn't been great. He's not assumed the mantle from Damian Lillard like I think people had hoped. So he's not a franchise player. He's probably a sixth man. So what team is good enough and inexpensive enough that it's ready to take on a $25 million sixth man who you're going to need to pay in another year if you want him beyond next season. Mm-hmm. So those are the main three guys who I think, when we talk expensive, the Blazers would be looking to trade. I don't know that you're going to see them be able to move off of any of them by February 6th. It is a tall task, which leads back to the conversation we've been having since the fall.
Know where we're going.
Since way back in 2024, we were having this conversation, but really we could have been having this conversation in 2023. The player who I think the Blazers will ultimately move off of is Robert Williams III. He's currently healthy, not able to crack the rotation because the Blazers wanted to play Donovan Clingan, and they're stuck with DeAndre Ayton. So, Donovan Clingan is the center of the future. Robert Williams is a free agent after next season, 27 years old, injury prone, has a very palatable contract that teams can figure out how to fit in, more than likely, $12 million a year. Whereas, and he doesn't help the Blazers right now. And the Blazers aren't going to pay him to keep him around for another year. That doesn't make sense when you have a young center of the future. So I've seen some discourse on this that goes different ways, but I keep checking in with people on Robert Williams, and nobody has indicated to me that the Blazers should or will do anything than, wait until the trade deadline and then get whatever they can for Robert Williams, the maximum value. And there are plenty of teams that need a center, that need a guy who can go rim protect, catch lobs, it just makes sense in every single box. So I do think that they're going to be able to trade Robert Williams. If they're able to do anything else, I think I'd be a little bit surprised if they're able to do anything else at the trade deadline.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's a Matisse Thybulle trade out there, but since he's been injured all year.
Been injured and also sort of a problematic player because he's so one-dimensional. Financially, he fits in the same way Robert Williams does. But he's hard to play because he's not a threat offensively, or he's such a small threat offensively. But yeah, that's another guy. And if the Blazers were able to do something bigger, that's a guy that would probably get included.
Yeah.
But again, it's hard to make moves right now. And unless it's a player that teams really want, they're not taking on, essentially dead money.
Also, just saying, we're talking about personally my two favorite interviews on the team, I think. But, and I know that doesn't mean anything to anybody, but I do think when we're talking about those two guys that, potentially could be traded, they do have a pretty, they both have this, this voice in the locker room that's a little bit bigger than what their roles are on the court, I would say. So,
and I think fans connect with that too. You know, this is like a fan base that really invests in and connects with its players.
mm-hmm.
And, you know, those are both extremely likable guys.
Yeah.
And so when you're the Blazers, you do have to factor in, if we're going to make a move, who are we getting? What are we getting back? What can we sell to our fan base? Because, you know, and I wrote this earlier this year about Robert Williams, but like, he's so easy to like. You know, when he's on the floor, he is, I mean, he could easily be your favorite player. The way he plays hard, plays with passion and enthusiasm. I remember the game against Minnesota. He left the floor, had a standing ovation from the crowd. I mean, for, a backup center, pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I think you have to think about the voices that you are losing within a locker room on a young team whose leadership core, I'm thinking, Jeremy Grant, Anthony Simons is naturally a little bit more quiet and just not, the vocal leaders that's just not a part of their DNA. So that's another thing to kind of think about when trading those other guys. But, obviously you got to do what you got to do at the same point in time. But I just it's going to be very interesting to see the reaction either way in terms of what the Blazers do or do not do.
It is interesting to think, though, that you have two very highly paid superstars in the NBA right now who are trying to get out of their situations, or whose teams want them out of their situation. Mm-hmm. You alluded to Miami and Jimmy Butler. Sounds like he's going to get traded. Brad Beal in Phoenix, that's been a disaster ever since he arrived from Washington. He has no trade clause, and I think he's planning on flexing it. But you disagree that he hasn't been a disaster?
No, I'm saying shocker.
Right. But so, I mean, those are difficult, big contracts to move. And you start looking around the league at who has the pieces to help facilitate a trade like that. If it ends up needing to be a 3-team sort of deal, the Blazers could get involved with one of those. And that's where I think you could see a Jeremy Grant sort of deal manifest, as if the Blazers were to get involved on one of those players. Not that they would take back Jimmy Butler or Bradley Beal. Bradley Beal is not waiving his no trade clause to come to Portland, but he might. But
I'm just laughing at the absolute absurdity of Jimmy Butler getting traded to Portland after everything that occurred a few summers ago.
But the idea of the Blazers
not happening, but it's hilarious.
But the idea of the Blazers being the third team to facilitate a trade there, feels possible. So, something to monitor, watch. But again, hard to trade money in the NBA right now, and I think that the Blazers took on a lot of this money under one CBA with sort of a plan of how they were going to navigate that going forward. And again, talk about systems that were designed for different worlds. The Blazers roster and salary structure, was designed under a previous CBA. And, this is not just the Blazers. A lot of teams have been, I don't want to say caught off guard, but have really struggled to adapt to the new CBA and the new rules. And I don't think anybody really did a good job of being able to see around that particular corner.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this a little bit pre-pod, but just what are your thoughts on where the Blazers stand right now in terms of their standings in the NBA and the fact that they are winning some games, not all games? I mean, they obviously didn't win in Detroit the other night, that sort of stuff, but they did win in Milwaukee the night before. Like, just what are your thoughts on what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little surprising that they aren't worse. Right now, the Blazers are 12-23. Washington has the worst record in the league at 6-28. We heard so much coming into the season about just how tough the Blazers' schedule was over those first couple of months. I think at one point somebody said it was the second most difficult schedule in the last 40 years in the NBA or something like to that effect. So, I mean, it's been the expectation has always been that the Blazers would finish with one of the 3 worst records and that they would then have one of the 3 best chances at the number 1 overall pick. They have not taken themselves out of that of the running for that, by the way. I mean, there are teams like there are teams who are worse than them and kind of around them that you would expect to maybe get better. Like New Orleans, I don't know what New Orleans is going to do. I mean, trade Brandon Ingram if they can. But, so I guess there's really no incentive for New Orleans to try to win at this point, but that's a team that has enough talent to start winning games. Toronto has enough talent to start winning some games. I mean, the 4 worst teams in the league should be the Wizards, Jazz, Blazers, and Nets.
I was
the
going to say
Nets are actually
yeah.
a little better than the Blazers. They have 13 wins, and Charlotte's been really bad. They have 8 wins. But every time the Blazers win, I do sort of cringe, and I hate to say that because, like, obviously you want your team to do well. You want to see the city's team do well, but like winning at this point does sort of put them more on the path toward mediocrity than success. And maybe mediocrity isn't the worst thing in the world. The Blazers have spent like most of my lifetime and most of yours being in the middle, right? Being, a 4 through 8 seed in the playoffs, getting to the playoffs and getting swept. I mean, I've seen it so many times in my life. And that has always been sort of like the culture. And it's, where it's like, but the way of the modern NBA, that's not a productive way to live, especially when you're not going to sign free agents. Players aren't going to force their hand to get traded to Portland. We saw that when Dame was here. Like, as great as Dame was, and as close as some of those teams were to being contender level good, they still couldn't really find a player who was like, yeah, get me to Portland so I can go play with Dame. And it leaves you in a place where it's like, what other choice do you have but to build through the draft? And that's not a surefire thing. That has backfired in plenty of places. But in a draft like this one, which has 2, maybe 3 guys who are viewed as, at minimum, all-star caliber players, like, how do you not put yourself in the best position to go get one of them? And that's the challenge, where I'm just not sure how fans are supposed to feel when the team goes and wins in Milwaukee. Like, that's objectively cool. Like, they played well. They beat Dame on the road. Like, that's the sort of thing that fans should feel good about. And yet, but if I'm a fan, I'm also getting a little wary of this whole rebuilding through the draft thing. Because I look at Scoot Henderson and I'm like, wait a minute. I thought he was supposed to be the guy. I thought he was the guy who made it worth trading Dame. And he has not been that. And so, I'm sitting here saying, oh, there's at least 2 guys who are all-star, all-NBA players. Well, they have to play. They have to get on the floor. They have to match up with NBA competition. Like, it doesn't matter how good Cooper Flagg looks at Duke or how good he looked in high school, or how good Ace Bailey looks in the Big Ten at Rutgers. But the problem is the Blazers have put themselves in this position where the only real choice they have for acquiring talent is to do it through the draft. And so, I mean, to that end, every win, does hurt them, especially when they are sitting, pretty far outside of the bottom 3. If they had 2 wins right now, yeah, I could appreciate a 3rd win and like the meaning of that and like it being good for the locker room. But right now, you're 4 wins better than the number again, I'm looking at the reverse ranking. So the number 3 team, you're 4 wins better than Toronto and Charlotte, who both have 8. You have the 6th worst record in the NBA. If the season was to end today with the 6th worst record in the NBA, you have a 9% chance of getting the top overall pick instead of 14 with one of the bottom 3. And when your only real path is development and draft and develop, like, you have to give yourself the best possible chance to acquire the talent. Like, I don't love it. Like, I don't think it like really is good for the integrity of the sport, but how else are they going to get good again?
Wow, you had a lot more to say there than I even thought. Look at you. Yeah, I mean,
I spend a lot of time thinking about this. Like, an unhealthy amount of time thinking about this, because it does trouble me to be on the side of just lose, baby. Like, that sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, the Blazers winning because, DeAndre Ayton is playing well is probably one of the worst possible things that could happen, unless it's going to lead to a DeAndre Ayton trade, which I so far I remain completely unconvinced is going to manifest at least before the trade deadline next year. And probably the more likely scenario is they try to trade him at the trade deadline next year. He doesn't get traded, and then they waive him and they buy him out, at the end of the 2026 season. And he goes and signs with the Lakers and is bad there.
Spoken like a true former Lakers beat writer.
I know how this goes.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. I'm not concerned about the winning right now.
It is early. I think that's a really important point.
It's early.
They have, let me just do the math here real quick, and then I'm going to shut up for a long time. They're only 35 games into the season. So being 12-23 is not, the same as being 41-41, but with 47 games to go, you probably need to go 9-31, 8-32. I think my math has taken a tank job here. That's not quite right, but whatever. At some point you have to start losing way more games than you're winning at a higher rate than they have been.
Well, I will say the Blazers have proven that they are willing to tank, baby, and when they do, they will do it spectacularly. Remember a few years ago when they decided to employ the tank, and then the team kept winning, and they had to pull, even when they had to make up injuries and pull people out.
I just don't know if waiting until the All-Star break, which is what they've done the last 3 years, is going to be soon enough, given the rate at which they've been able to pick up the occasional win and how bad some of these other teams have been.
I guess I'm just not quite in panic mode on that at this point. I understand the thought process, but I'm just not quite there yet. What is interesting, you make a point that we're 35 games in and the Blazers have won 12 games and their over under for wins this year was 24.5. So they are close to halfway to that, which is actually pretty interesting. But I guess I'm in the camp of, hey, a few wins are good for morale for these young players to see that they can do it. And maybe that long term makes things a bit healthier than if they are just going into a season just lose.
I think that's really fair. I think that's a really fair point.
I think that there's also something to be said about, having some tangible evidence for those young players for the future that they can actually do it and not having the confidence beat out of them before they even get the shot. So
there's a lot to be said for learning how to win and not becoming so accustomed to losing. Yeah. And I think, when you look at somebody like Shaedon Sharpe, that's all he's known in his career. And he's going to be going into his fourth season before he even is on a team that is trying to win. Toumani Camara, that's a winning basketball player, but he's been part of a lot of losses. Donovan Clingan has won his entire life, but now he's losing. Scoot Henderson, what does he take out of these seasons? I think that's a really fair question. Yeah.
So I think the losing is coming, and I think that for right now we should just maybe enjoy the occasional win and not put too much. I'm not there in terms of getting too invested in them yet. Obviously, as the season gets closer and closer to winding down, and we see more and more Cooper flag poster dunks. You see his dunk the other night? Yo. You see more of those? It's all right, okay, I'm here, I'm ready. Let me lose, baby. But for right now, I'm just okay, I'm just not going to let myself get too invested in this situation in terms of draft stock until I need to let myself get invested. So, give me a few more weeks.
So last year, Atlanta won the number one pick with a 4.5% chance.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
9. Because the way the odds have been flattened, Like it used to be that like it was really rare that you'd see a team go from like 7 or 5 or 6 or 8. The league has tried to disincentivize tanking by flattening the odds so the worst team doesn't have such a stacked chance. So I guess the question I would leave you with is, how important do you think it is for them to be in that bottom 3 when the season ends?
Yeah, that's the other thing, is that, it's not like the NFL where the season ends and it's like, okay, this is the draft order. That's not the situation here. P.S. What the heck, Patriots? But anyways, like that's not the. So there is a certain, percentage place you want to be. But I mean, the year that the Blazers got number 1 in the draft with Greg Oden, nobody thought that they were going to get number 1 that year. I remember coming out of school and being like, oh, sick. Like, you just. So these things don't necessarily always align in those ways. So, and almost, I think sometimes I wonder if having the worst odds are the best odds, I guess you could say, to get the number 1 pick is actually like the worst. 'Cause it so rarely ends up working out that way, I feel like. So, it's another good point that a lot of times, like, it just doesn't end up actually going the way that you think it's going to go with that sort of stuff. So there's a certain line I think that you should be around, but at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily mean anything.
Also, what if you trade DeAndre Ayton and Jeremy Grant and you start winning a bunch of games because your young guys are actually good, which would be a development. But
yeah. Yes, it would be.
I guess that'd be a good problem for the Blazers to have that they don't currently have, at least on a night in, night out basis.
Yes.
Okay, Brenna, I feel like we should close out our first podcast of 2025 on that uplifting note.
Yeah,
I think,
wow.
we're going to be turning the camera forward, which is college basketball. The Oregon men had a huge win over Maryland over the weekend, but also a huge loss before that. But that's a good Maryland team that was flirting with the top 25 and has some very good players. So that was a nice win for the Ducks. The Oregon State women are starting to make some noise in the WCC, have a big game against San Francisco on Thursday, as a matter of fact. But we will focus on all that stuff coming back, heading into the spring. And any final parting notes on the Rose Bowl before we close the book on that until the start of spring football?
Great experience. I am team. The Rose Bowl should be the national championship game, by the way.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah. It needs to be a thing. We just need to make the Rose Bowl the national championship game. Stop screwing around. If there's anything that is right for the sport, it's that. So let's just have all roads lead to Pasadena every year.
I like that a whole lot. And as somebody who doesn't need to ever cover another college football game in an NFL stadium, an NFL dome, I fully support that proposal.
Now, what do you do with the parade? What do you do with that sort of stuff? But I think that might be the one situation where maybe they say, okay, we will change things up and not have everything be on January 1st this year. If you just say, hey, you're the national championship game every year.
Oh, I see what you're saying, because you can't have the national championship game on January 1. I got it. Okay. Yep. Good question. Fun discussion, Brenna. Thank you so much. Welcome back to the Pacific Northwest. I know it's been a little while, but I think we're both still kind of getting our legs back under. After a long college football season. So great catching up, and we will be back next week with another episode of the Oregonian Sports Podcast. Tell your friends. You've got friends. You spent New Year's with them. Tell them to listen to the Oregonian Sports Podcast.
People do things on New Year's.
And if you have a chance, go ahead and give us one of those 5-star ratings. It really helps us out. And remember, you can get the Oregonian Sports Podcast wherever you get podcasts. We are everywhere. We are in all of the places.
Go find us
in them, and we'll be back next week.